Judge Walter Grayson thought he was dealing with just another reckless teenager until the defendant did something no one expected. With the confidence of a seasoned attorney, he began picking apart the prosecution's case piece by piece, leaving everyone in the courtroom stunned. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation, almost suffocating. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, spectators whispering among themselves, eager to witness what they assumed would be an open-and-shut case. But nothing about this trial was ordinary. At the defendant's table, a young man stood with his hands casually tucked into his pockets. Though the table seemed too large for him, his presence was anything but small. Chin lifted just enough to project quiet defiance, he made it clear. He wasn't scared. His name? Jalen Dawson. 19 years old, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Serious charges. But if the expression on Judge Grayson's face meant anything, the real trial had little to do with the law itself. Leaning back in his chair, the judge tapped his fingers against the polished wooden desk, a slow, deliberate rhythm. His gaze drifted over his glasses, landing on Jalen with a smirk that barely hid his amusement. "So, you think you're some kind of legal expert?" His tone was thick with condescension. "This isn't a debate club, kid." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They all found it amusing. But Jalen? He didn't even flinch. He wasn't here to entertain them. He had spent years preparing, not for this exact moment, but for one like it. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Jalen was memorizing legal precedents. While his friends played video games, he simulated mock trials in his mind, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had been a paralegal for over 2 decades, and he had grown up absorbing every story she brought home. The corruption, the shortcuts prosecutors took, the judges who played favorites, the defense attorneys who barely put up a fight. By 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But to Judge Grayson, none of that mattered. To him, Jalen was just another troublemaking kid wasting his time. "Let's move this along," Grayson sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Barely noticeable, but it was there. Because Judge Grayson had just made his first mistake. He just didn't realize it yet. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood with the confidence of a man who had already won. Everything about him was polished, from his perfectly knotted tie to the way his words rolled off his tongue, rehearsed and sharp. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6 reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel." Carrington's voice carried an air of finality. "The evidence speaks for itself." The words hit like a hammer. The crowd in the gallery murmured, shifting in their seats. It sounded airtight. A stolen car. A high-speed chase. Running from the police. What more was there to say? Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen again, unimpressed. "Go on." Carrington strode toward the jury box, his shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance," he said, turning to lock eyes with Jalen for the first time. His smirk widened. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen, however, remained unmoved. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the sworn testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." To most people in the room it did. The case seemed simple. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks forming in the foundation. Still, he remained silent. Watching. Waiting. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Jalen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since the trial began. She hesitated before rising from her seat. "Your Honor, my client." But before she could finish, Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She froze, searching his face, then slowly sat back down. And then, for the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Judge Grayson blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then, his lips twitched into something resembling amusement. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice didn't waver. "I'll be defending myself." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Even Carrington's confidence faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. "Well," he chuckled, shaking his head, "this should be interesting." But the moment Jalen took his first step forward, the laughter stopped. Because everything was about to change. He adjusted his stance, keeping his hands in his pockets, letting the silence stretch just a second too long, long enough to make the room uncomfortable. And then, with the same calm, steady voice, he spoke again. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington arched an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Jalen took a slow breath. And then, the real trial began. Jalen stepped forward, his posture unwavering, his expression calm. His voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a knife. "Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest, correct?" Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington exhaled sharply, already looking bored with the line of questioning. "That's right," he replied, his tone dismissive. "And that testimony is documented in his official report." Jalen pressed, his gaze locked on Carrington. "Of course it is." Carrington scoffed, as if the question itself was ridiculous. Jalen gave a slow nod, then turned to face Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to have that testimony dismissed as evidence." The judge squinted at him, clearly intrigued but skeptical. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another step forward, deliberate, steady. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report states that he witnessed me inside the vehicle, then his location data should confirm that." He let his words hang in the air before adding, "But something tells me it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. The weight of the room had shifted. Judge Grayson frowned, his gaze flicking toward Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor." "Are we seriously considering taking the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Jalen barely shrugged, his expression casual. "If the officer was exactly where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will back him up. But if he wasn't," he let the sentence trail off, the implication heavy in the air. A long silence stretched between them. Grayson studied Jalen for a moment, then slowly turned back to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any objections to verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. Just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen took a slow, measured breath. Years of watching trials, analyzing the tactics of prosecutors, and studying their every move had taught him one undeniable truth. If Carrington truly believed his case was airtight, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Finally, Carrington shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But it was too late. The shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing. The courtroom was silent. But the tension? It was deafening. Carrington shuffled his papers, the polished confidence he had worn so effortlessly now showing its first cracks. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, one fact remains undeniable. The The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. That's true. He took another step forward, his voice calm but deliberate. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, his gaze sweeping across their faces, making direct eye contact with each one of them. The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were in that car, it automatically means I stole it. That's the story they're selling you. But let's step back and think about this logically for a moment. He took a breath, keeping his tone steady, controlled. Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket, he began. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, and then put it back on the rack before walking out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that same jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints were on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery murmured under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven just hours before it was reported stolen. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And, yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit. Let them absorb it. Then, in a voice sharp enough to slice through the silence, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington shifted, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. But Jalen wasn't done. And while we're talking about evidence, let's discuss how that fingerprint analysis was conducted. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated before reluctantly admitting, "No." Jalen pressed his lips together, nodding like that answer was all he needed to hear. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice measured. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine? No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody? No way to challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen tilted his head slightly. "Interesting." Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing that this case was not going to be the easy, straightforward one he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't done. Because what he was about to say next, it would change everything. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned, leaning forward slightly. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes." Mr. Raymond Weir, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police the night his car was reported missing. A statement that, for some reason, never made it into the prosecution's filings. Silence. Jalen turned to Carrington, his stare unwavering. "Do you recall what Mr. Weir told officers that night?" The prosecutor clenched his jaw. He knew. And for the first time since the trial began, Mitchell Carrington looked worried.